welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on religion and society, in today's lecture we are going to discuss a prescribed reading in the syllabus Religion and Society for second semester BA multidisciplinary course, and this reading is by T.N. Madan. The title of the article is Secularism in its Place. This is a chapter from T.N. Madan's book Secularism in India. Let us try to understand how T.N. Madan looks into the way secularism has evolved from the West and kind of becomes a misfit in the South Asian context. So, to begin with, T.N. Madan in his essay Secularism in its Place critiques the ideology of secularism in South Asia. He argues that while the Western model of secularism is a gift of Christianity that cannot be easily transplanted into the totalizing religious landscape of India. Madan suggests that the attempt to create a neutral state in South Asia is like trying to remove the foundation of a building while expecting it to stand. When the state tries to claim a secular space that is independent of religion, it is just creating a new department. It is challenging the very hierarchy that gives the people's life meaning. And therefore, he is kind of looking into the hierarchy of the secular and the sacred and goes back to the tradition to understand the hierarchical diarchy. He invokes the Rig Veda and the concept of diarchy to understand the significance of secularism in South Asia. He argues that in South Asian worldview, secular power, that is the king and the state, isn't just a separate department of life, it is a subordinate partner that requires spiritual authority to function correctly. So, if you see from the traditional way in which the society was functioned, the king always dependent on the saint or the rishi who were kind of considered as more dominant than the secular powers of the king. T.N. Madan uses the relationship between the Shatra, that is the temporal power, regnum, and the Brahma, which is the spiritual authority or sacerdotium, to show how power was traditionally legitimized in India. The relationship is described as being like a husband and wife. They are distinct, yet they must speak with one voice. The word for priest literally implies precedence. The king explicitly tells the priest, quickened by thee, I shall perform deeds. So, it is always a subordinate relation of the secular to the sacred. Power without a spiritual principle is considered unquickened or illegitimate. The king provides the force, but the priest provides the reason for that force. Therefore, we look into the work of Louis Dumont and the hierarchical diarchy to explain that even when the king's role looks secular, dealing with taxes, war and administration, it is still encompassed by a higher moral order. And therefore, if we look into the concepts to help us understand this diarchy, the first category is dharma. The domain, it belongs to the sacred and the moral order. And what is the role in society? It is encompassing principle that defines right and wrong. The second concept is artha. Artha is the secular power or the economics. And the meaning is that the pursuit of interest and power which must exist within the bounds of dharma. In this view, artha or the secular realm is recognized as a discrete area of life, but it is never free from dharma. Secularism in the Western sense asks artha to stand alone. Madan argues that in South Asia, artha simply cannot subsist on its own, and therefore he kind of looks into the modern conflict. So, he moves from the traditional bond between the secular and the sacred to the emergence of conflict with modernity. And T.N. Madan explains why modern secularism feels so alien or arrogant to the South Asian majority because there is a total separation of the church and the state. They are two different buildings on the same street. So, from traditional time when they were nested together, modernity led to the separation of the two. The state is a smaller room inside the larger house of religion and dharma. When the modern Indian state tries to act as a neutral arbiter, it is essentially trying to break out of that house. To the believer, a state that does not bow to a higher moral spiritual principle is not neutral. It is directionless or even monstrous. So, T.N. Madan then reinterprets Kautilya's Arthasastra to help us understand secularism better. According to T.N. Madan, the Arthasastra is often called the Indian Machiavelli because of its close, cold-blooded focus on spies, war and statecraft, which is Artha. Madan argues that this is a surface level reading. Artha, which is the political economic interest, is not an end in itself. It must be pursued within the framework of karma, which is desire, dharma, which is ethics and duty, and moksha, which is liberation. In traditional Brahminical thought, the king wasn't the head of a state religion. Instead, his specific duty, his Rajdharma, was to be the protector of everyone's religion. He ensured the social order so that others could practice their faith. And therefore, then after looking into the Kautilya Arthasastra, T.N. Madan moves to Mahatma Gandhi and considers him as a modern traditionalist. Madan presents Gandhi not as a secularist in the Western state, but as an ultimate defender of the hierarchical relationship between religion and politics. Gandhi famously stated that those who believe religion and politics are separate do not know what religion means. For Gandhi, religion provides the absolute values, that is, truth and non-violence. Politics is just the arena where those values are tested. Without the religious foundation, politics becomes debased or corrupt. Gandhi did believe that the state and religion should be separate, but in a very specific way. And these are, number one, the state should handle secular welfare, that is roads, health and safety. The state has no right to interfere in the religious life of the people. Number three, religions must survive on their own merit, not on state handouts. And therefore, it kind of leads to a irreversible hierarchy. That in South Asia, the separation of the state and church and the state is fundamentally different from that than it was in Europe. And the feature is, or we look into the relationship, the Western secularism or Christendom, the state and the church were parallel and then they were separated, whereas in the Gandhian or the Indian model, it is hierarchical and encompassed. The state role in the Western secularism was neutral, distant. In the Gandhian model or the Indian model, the state is the protector of dharmas, all dharmas. The third concept is authority. So, in the Western secularism, authority was the law is supreme, whereas in the Gandhian model, dharma is supreme, the law serves the dharma. After moving from Gandhi, he kind of looks into the Islam as a religion to help us problematize secularism in India. T.N. Madan's exploration of Islam in South Asia serves as the final brick in his argument that secularism is a conceptual misfit for the region. He demonstrates that in Islam, the distinction between church and the state is not just blurred, it is doctrinally non-existent. The divine chain of command, traditional Islamic political theory, does not recognize an autonomous secular space. Instead, it possessed a vertical hierarchy of authority that begins and ends with the divine. And here, the kind of, when we look into the way in which secularism is described in reference to Islam, it says God is Muhammad Prophet, and Muhammad Prophet is a caliph and the king. In this model, the king is merely the shadow of God on earth. His power is trust, amana, and he is morally accountable to his maker. So then the secular and the sacred again collapse. T.N. Madan cites the medieval theological Ziauddin Barni, who described religion and government as twin brothers, but always prioritized the spiritual brothers over the temporal one. He highlights Muhammad Iqbal as the definitive 20th century voice on this subject. Iqbal's philosophy completely subverts the Western definition of secular versus sacred. Iqbal argued that an act isn't secular or religious because of what it is, but because of the attitude with which it is done. In a stunning reversal of secularist logic, Iqbal claimed that since all the reality is spiritual at its roots, all is holy ground. The church and the state are simply two different ways of looking at the exact same reality. To try to separate them is like trying to separate a person from the shadow. And therefore, Madan moves on to use the work of Fazlur Rahman to explain the danger Muslims sees in secularism. According to Rahman, by removing the sanctity from moral values, secularism makes them temporary, subjective, and prone to corruption. Rahman rejects both Western secularism, which he sees as godless, and neo-revivalism, which he sees as intellectually bankrupt. He argues that a Muslim can and should be modern, but that modernity must be informed by faith. And that is that modernity does not lead to loss of humanity. If you do not have religion or you do not have the moral respect of the sacred, then it implies that there is a loss of humanity. Without that religious anchor, Rahman wants human risk losing the very humanity. T.N. Madan's long journey through Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Islam leads to a single devastating conclusion for the modernist minority in South Asia. Whether you look at the Vedic Purohit, the Sikh Granth Sahib, or the Islamic Din and Dawla, the conclusion remains the same. In South Asia, the secular has no independent existence, it is a subset of the sacred. And therefore, he says that what we have understood as secularism is the meaning and definition coming from the West. He traces the Christian roots of secularism. He explains why Western secularism feels like a foreign body. He argues that secularism is a gift of Christianity to the world, and trying to give that gift to South Asia without translating it is an act of cultural erasure. Madan aligns with the giants like Max Weber and Peter Berger to argue that secularization didn't happen because people suddenly became smarter or scientific. It happened because of a specific shift within Christianity. And what was that shift? The shift was the Protestant break. And this he helps us to understand the Christian roots of secularism. Protestantism cut the umbilical cord between heaven and earth by making salvation a private matter between the individual and God, bypassing the church. So, this kind of gives less significance to the sacred, which is the church, and there was a growing significance of your personal, materialistic, secular life. The second reason for the birth of secularism from Christianity is the privatization of religion. This created a secular space where the state and the science could operate without religious interference. And the third was the disenchantment of the world. As Weber puts it, the world became rationalized. Sublime values retreated from the public square into the private life. And therefore, the idea that all society would converge around secularism is basically an idea of fallism of universalism. That is, secularism is not a universal and uniform phenomena. T.N. Madan critiques Western social theories for taking a unique historical event, that is the European Reformation, and pretending it as a universal requirement for modernization everywhere. Moderns of modernization try to transfer secularism like a piece of software. Madan argues that this is impossible. If the underlying idea doesn't exist in the host culture, the word remains vacuous. In tradition haunted societies like India, forcing this Western model isn't just a political change, it is a conversion that leads to the loss of one's culture. Using the insight of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Madan points out the linguistic and conceptual wall. You can translate a word by word, but behind the word is an idea. And this idea you cannot translate if it does not exist among the people. In South Asia, the idea of private religion that has nothing to do with public politics simply doesn't exist in the collective memory. Therefore, when intellectuals preach secularism, it sounds like stray behavioralistic traits. It looks like a pose or an act rather than a lived truth, and therefore a gap exists between what intellectuals theorize and the way in which religion is practiced in the everyday life, in the public and in the collective. So, in that sense, the tradition cannot become a memory. T.N. Madan argues that you cannot start from a blank state. Once a culture has defined relationship between religion and politics as hierarchical and encompassed, any idea can only be a redefinition. Intellectual might adopt the borrowed ideas of the West, but the ordinary people continue live the tradition. This creates a massive disconnect seen in South Asian politics today. Then he kind of brings in the most important argument which any idea of secularism revolves around, and that is to bring in the two giants of Indian political thought, Gandhi and Nehru. T.N. Madan argues that Nehru's failure to understand the depth of religion led him to rely on an important strategy of secularism that ignored the very reality of the people he led. While Gandhi focused on the reformed individual, Nehru focused on the state, and that too an industrialized and a developed state. He saw the state as the engine of social change that would drag India out of what Hegel and other Westerners described as a stateless primordial existence. For Nehru, the state had to be a trinity of three, that is democracy, socialism and secularism. Democratic is to give power to the people, socialist by solving the crushing poverty of the masses, secularist keeping religious irrationality out of public life. For Nehru basically, and this is how he is known, the industries, the factories and dams were the temples that had to be worse. So, he was kind of more tilted towards the materialistic development, and he said that once materialism, infrastructural development takes place, spirituality and religious will come on its own. So, T.N. Madan highlights a specific blind spot in Nehru's thinking. Nehru, influenced by Marxist and Enlightenment ideas, believed that religion was a surface phenomena that would disappear once people focused on their stomachs. Critique Nehru believed that once people understood the economic interest, religious differences would recede into the background. T.N. Madan argues that this was a fundamental misunderstanding of the South Asian psychology. In this region, the religious bond has proven time and again to be more resilient and emotionally charged than the economic bond. In a region where over 90% of the population identifies strongly with a faith tradition, a secularism that views religion as hindrance or an illusion is naturally going to face massive resistance. And therefore, he kind of looks into the negative strategy of the way in which constitution was looking, or the constitutional version of secularism. His most insightful critique of Indian constitution's version of secularism is that it is a negative strategy. Unlike the US, which has a wall of separation, India attempts equidistance or neutrality. This brand of secularism is defined by what the state won't do, that is, favor one religion. Madan argues that you cannot build a positive national identity on denials and negational alone. Nehru tried to replace religious sentimentality with a scientific temper. But Madan points out that science can explain how things work, but it rarely explains why life is meaningful, a gap religion fills for millions. Madan is not calling for a theocracy. Instead, he is calling for a re-evaluation. He suggests that secularism in South Asia must be, number one, compatible with faith. It cannot be war on religion. Number two, more than rationalism. It must acknowledge that logic isn't the only thing that moves human being. Translated, it must find a proper means for its expression that resonates with the history and culture of the region. And therefore, he kind of looks into the other thinkers of their time and of the 20th century to show what a strong secularizing state looks like. So, you have Lenin from USSR, Atatürk from Turkey and Nehru from India. He is doing a comparison of the three. When we look into the view of religion, Lenin felt that religion was a senseless idea and it created a false consciousness. Atatürk from Turkey believed that religion was a barrier to westernization and progress. For Nehru, it was a private matter to be honored equally. The method, direct abolition, that is, Lenin believed that you have to abolish religion, decrees to separate church state and state run atheist education. From Turkey, Atatürk said that strict enforcement, abolish caliphate, Sharia courts and even religious dress. And in India, Nehru's method was liberal tolerance, guaranteed rights to practice and propagate your own religion. What was the result of these ideas? In USSR, there was a top-down institutional secularization. In Turkey, there was forced modernization of the public sphere. And in India, constitutional ambiguity, a secular state in a communally divided society. And therefore, T.N. Madan points out at the constitutional paradox. He points out a glaring contradiction in the Indian constitution. While it aimed for a secular state, it simultaneously encouraged communal division through specific articles. Article 15, prohibition discrimination on grounds of religion, the secular idea. Article 25 and 30, these are some of the articles which are paradoxical according to T.N. Madan. Article 25 and 30 protects the right of religious minority to establish their own educational institution and propagate the faith. This is a communal reality. By allowing the propagation of religion and the communalization of education, the state essentially subsidized the very forces that would eventually challenge secular authority. T.N. Madan notes the word secular wasn't even added to the preamble until 1976, long after Nehru's death. Why did Nehru fail to act decisively Madan suggests two reasons. Number one, Nehru was cultured aristocrat and a liberal who found strong arm method distasteful. Number two, he was too optimist. He truly believed religion was a dying vested interest that would vanish at the touch of reality, and the touch of the reality was economic progress. Society in England is more advanced in this respect than in India, even though our constitution may be more advanced. This is a statement from Nehru, and that shows his optimism towards economic growth. It reveals Nehru's tragic realization. He had given India a modern brain, that is the constitution, but the body, that is the society, was still living in a traditional hierarchical age. So basically, we kind of look into the double blind that he is pointing out. Madan is citing Ashish Nandi and lighting a devastating paradox in modern Indian politics. First, it is divisive. Violent and communal aspects have successfully entered politics. Its ethical values, that is, mercy, integrity, and self limitations, have been excluded from public life. We are left with a politics that is fueled by religious identity but emptied of religious ethic. Madan describes secularism as an idea that has conquered the minds of his generation, a chain they cannot break without breaking their hearts. So that is the result, is saying that it has created a vacuum which has got filled by fundamentalism. Because the ideology of secularism remained alien and was not backed by coercive power of the state, it failed to take root. In the vacuum left by this impotent secularism, the totalizing religion of South Asia did not disappear, they became radicalized. And this led to the revival of Hinduism, Muslim fundamentalism, Sikh fundamentalism. Now, these movements provided the positive identity and emotional resonance that Nehru negative secularism, that is based on denial and economic logic, could not offer. So, basically, the whole idea is that T.N. Madan is suggesting a re-evaluation of the way in which the state has kind of understood secularism, and it is important that we do not borrow it from the way it has been defined and practiced in the West, because of the variance of religion and also the totalizing effect of religion on individuals' life in India. This is the complete understanding of the reading Secularism in its Place by T.N. Madan. It is published in his book Secularism in India. It is advised to read this article to understand the lecture better. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.